Good morning, all. Thanks for joining us promptly. We'll be waiting just a couple more minutes for other folks to join before we get started. Good morning. Welcome to those who have joined us. We're going to wait just another minute or two to get critical mass, and then we'll get started. All right, good morning and welcome to those of us joined us. I see that we still have a few people joining, but we will go ahead and get started just with some introductions and housekeeping before we get into the heart of our time together today. So welcome to the Pathways Stakeholder Process workshop number 1. We will be here today for 2 hours together from 9 to 11 Pacific, 10 to 12 Mountain, and 11 to 1 Central. Sarah, if you could move to the next slide, please. So we're going to start off with a handful of introductions, including, of course, myself. So my name is Neha Bazaj. I am a director at GridWorks, and GridWorks is supporting the Pathways Launch Committee with this particular piece of the summer workshop series. At this point, I'd like to invite members of the launch committee participants and any state participants to raise their hand using the Zoom raise hand function, as well as anyone else in the Zoom room today who intends to be an active participant. We know there's a lot of people here today just here to learn about what's happening, and that's totally welcome. But if you plan to be an active participant, please do raise your hand. Great. And I'm just going to cherry pick a couple of folks. I'd love for you to come off mute to share your name, the organization that you're affiliated with, and one nice thing about a place in the West that's outside of your home state. I'll give you all a minute while I share mine. I was lucky enough to sail in college and got to go up to the Columbia River Gorge in April when it was fresh snow melt. And I have lots of very fond memories of that. I don't think it's something I would do now, but 20-year-old me loved it. Kathleen, can I start with you?
You sure can. Thanks, Neha. I'm Kathleen Stacks. I'm the Executive Director of Western Freedom and also the co-chair of the Pathways Initiative Launch Committee. And I got engaged in the Tetons National Park, so have some fond memories those parts of the region on a trip that took us to the Tetons and Yellowstone and Glacier. So some of my favorite parts of the whole world.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Mary Winky, can I have you go next?
Sure, this is Mary Winky. I am the executive director of the Public Generating Pool. And my family and I were lucky enough to get to go to Santa Fe, New Mexico this year for spring break. And it's just such a unique place with so much history and art and natural surroundings to explore. It was really quite special.
Thanks so much, Mary. John Olson.
Thank you. Trying to get off mute. My apologies.
All good.
John Wilson, Director of Energy Trading Contracts at SMUD. I'm actually a Midwesterner by nature, but I have a transplant to California. I enjoy all of the outdoors on the West Coast. In particular, I know it's not the coast, but I would have to echo Kathleen and say Yellowstone.
Thanks so much, John. Kyla McNabb.
Hi, I'm Kyla McNabb representing NRDC and the Sustainable FERC Project. I actually currently reside in Oklahoma, but very much have enjoyed several trips out west between Colorado, Utah, Arizona, California, and the Pacific Northwest. But my favorite, not to jump on the bandwagon of Yellowstone and Tetons, but my son is a scout. And last year, he and his troop, there is a special scout camp that is located within the park and within the Tetons, and they get access to certain trails and lakes and things to do that general visitors don't get access to. And so I think for him to have an experience with his troop, along with all the scout elements of leave no trace and learning about nature and everything, it was an amazing experience. And he still talks about it to this day. So I was really thankful for that opportunity that he got to have.
Thanks so much. And I'll close out our live introductions with Brian Turner, but if anyone else on the call would like to share their name or their favorite place in the West in the chat, please feel free to do so.
Well, thanks, Neha. Hi, folks. Brian Turner with Advanced Energy United. Really pleased to be here. My story was a couple years ago when the Western Interstate Energy Board held their meeting up in Boise. I decided to drive up and took some time to check out the hot springs in central northern Nevada. And then after the meeting, went over from Boise to Sun Valley. And that highway, if y'all haven't tried it before, there's a dozen different hot springs parks, waterfalls of hot springs. It was just tremendous. Absolutely beautiful trip. And in the energy context, reminded me of the great energy we've got under our feet.
Excellent. Thanks, Brian. With that, I invite folks to put their hands down. And again, feel free to share your favorite place in the West in the chat if you'd like to. And with that, I'll turn things over to Kathleen for a few minutes to set the stage for us.
Thanks, Neha. And let me know if I get too choppy. I'm in a place where the internet isn't great, so I can turn off my video if I need to. But wanted to take a moment and just provide a little bit of context on the Pathways Initiative for those who might be new and joining us for the first time on this call. Just real quickly, we are about a year in. Actually, was reminded recently that the letter that kicked this off came out a little more about a year and a week ago. And so we're happy birthday, Pathways. And we are at a point now, we've been meeting, the launch committee has been meeting really in earnest since October. Through a lot of conversations and a lot of stakeholder feedback, put out a straw proposal at the end of April that laid out a 3-step process. The first step was is a an option that is possible without changing California law, and it proposes to elevate the authority of the EIM governing body from its current status as with sharing joint authority with the CAISO Board of Governors. Sorry, I'm all over the place. Elevate from joint authority to give the EIM governing body primary authority over the market services. So the EIM real-time market and the extended day ahead market once it goes live. And so that proposal had included a trigger for signed implementation agreements by a certain threshold of utilities outside of California. And the launch committee voted to approve that recommendation at the end of May and passed it on to the CAISO to move through its stakeholder process. And so the CAISO is still has an open process going. Public comments were due yesterday. There's going to be another stakeholder meeting on the 23rd for those who are interested. And so that is moving along. If the CAISO board and the EIM governing body approve that proposal, they'll start working on tariff language and anticipate having hopefully having those implementation agreements signed in early 2025. So hopefully in Q1, so that we can actually get that tariff filed and get that change implemented. Step 2 is really focusing on what was the core of the original Pathways Initiative letter from the regulators, and that is the creation of a new independent regional organization that can provide market services up to and including a full regional transmission organization for the largest footprint in the West, including California, designed to maximize customer benefits. And so we sort of put out a couple of different options of what this organization might look like as part of that straw proposal, and then and have been working with work groups over the summer to really work out some of the details to develop a final proposal later this fall. So we have this stakeholder process, which is the workshop that you are all here to participate in, is one of 6 work streams that is ongoing to really work through the details, all the details from this creating a new stakeholder process and building on the experience and expertise of people who have participated not just in the CAISO stakeholder process, but in other stakeholder processes in the West, including SPP's Markets Plus, the Western Resource Adequacy Program from the Western Power Pool, and then even looking at stakeholder processes for other RTOs and ISOs in other parts of the country. It's part of what we'll be talking about today. So looking at those pieces, as well as everything from what kind of corporate structure should this new regional organization have? What should its relationship with the CAISO be? What parts of the tariff will apply just to the new RO, and what will apply just to the CAISO balancing authority? And where is there some overlap? So a whole comprehensive set of technical questions that the work groups are working through, and that we'll be having a series of workshops over the next couple of months to get hopefully very robust stakeholder feedback. The idea is that we're going to take all of this feedback and develop a recommendation at the end of September to put out for, again, public comment and continue to refine this piece as we get through the end of the year. So I just wanted to, I appreciate the minutes. It's a very, very high level and not very detailed proposal. If you are new to this and you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or get on our landing page on the Western Interstate Energy Board website. You see the links there to the materials for today. Those are all housed on that website, and there is a lot of information about all of the work that we've done to get to the point where we are. So appreciate the opportunity to give a little bit of context for those who are new, and really look forward to a robust conversation today. So thank you, Neha, and you can take it away.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Moving into the agenda that you see here on the screen. So as Kathleen mentioned, we will be looking at a comparison of different ISO and RTO processes across the country. And then after a short break, we'll be moving into a discussion, trying to elicit reactions and thoughts about the stakeholder processes that currently exist across the country, and see what conclusions we can draw for what we need to focus on in this group. And then finally, we'll close out with our next steps. And so to that end, Sarah, could you do next slide for me, please? Sorry, I tried to advance it myself. Our desired outcomes for today, we know that folks are coming to this conversation with different levels of knowledge and understanding of stakeholder engagement in RTOs and ISOs across the country. And so our goal here today is really to level set and get everyone on the same page. And then, as I mentioned, we want to go through some reflections. So all the folks in here sharing some observations and reflections on what stakeholder engagement processes used across the country suggest for our work here together. And then we want to confirm our planned next steps for the next one. Tanya, would you mind using your phone? Or if we see you could mute her. Great, thank you. And then finally, this is the first of 4 workshops, and we just want to confirm that our plan for how we're going to spend the time together in the subsequent 3 workshops meets the needs of the group. Next slide, please. So to that end, as I mentioned, we have 4 facilitated stakeholder workshops together. Our core question is how best to structure the stakeholder process for providing input into the regional organization's consideration of market rules. All of the meetings will be virtual. They range from 2 to 3 hours each. And our goal is for these meetings to be as interactive as possible. Today's is an exception. We do have a presentation in the interest of level setting, but subsequent workshops will be much more discussion focused. Next slide, please. So today we're starting with an introduction to the briefing document. This is the briefing document that provides an overview of stakeholder engagement processes in ISOs and RTOs across the country. Our next workshops on July 24th and August 2nd will be addressing 2 primary categories of questions. The first being, how could issues and solutions before the regional organization get raised, and who leads? And then what could a sector-based committee and voting structure add? So today's level setting will hopefully help you all to participate in workshops 2 and 3, where we really want to explore those questions, encourage debate and dialogue. And then, as with many other workshops in this in the Pathways Initiative, there will be an opportunity for written stakeholder comments following the 3rd workshop, addressing issues raised during the first 3 workshops. Those comments, along with the discussion and dialogue that we have in the workshops themselves, will be used to inform a draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal that will be presented to the group on August 28th. And then this all closes out with another opportunity for written stakeholder comments on whatever was discussed in meeting 4, as well as on the straw proposal itself. So I'll just pause there for a moment. I know that was a lot of content. Does anyone have any questions? Feel free to either raise your hand or put them in the chat. Great. And similarly, as just a last point of housekeeping, As you have questions, feel free to use the Zoom chat function. We will be taking live Q&A following the briefing presentation, but if you have them come to you as the presentation is happening, as well as please use the Zoom chat for any technical needs that you might have if you're having trouble viewing anything, hearing anything, unmuting yourself, whatever it might be. All right. Great. With that, I will turn things over to my colleague Katie Wu to provide an overview of the research brief.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Katie Wu. I'm a senior fellow with GridWorks and happy to be with you all today to present an overview of the research brief we developed for this group, considerations for a Western regional organization stakeholder engagement process. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with grounding us in the phase 1 straw proposal from April this year. The launch committee recognized the opportunity to reevaluate how stakeholders engage with and shape rules for the EIM and EDAM, and is now seeking new meaningful ways for stakeholders to do that. And with this charge, GridWorks researched how RTOs and ISOs currently conduct stakeholder engagement and synthesized that information into a brief to spur discussion and support you all in determining which elements may be a good fit for the regional organization. Next slide, please. The research brief, which you all received as part of these meeting materials and Matthew has dropped a link to in the chat. The brief aims to document and synthesize stakeholder engagement practices of organizations comparable to the envisioned regional organization, offer questions for stakeholders to consider as the pathways stakeholder engagement workstream advances, and support upcoming workshops like the one we're in today and those that Neha just went over in the workshop plan. Next slide. To develop the brief, we researched the California ISO, Mid-Continent ISO or MISO, ISO New England, the relatively new Western Resource Adequacy Program and the Western Power Pool, Southwest Power Pool, PJM, and New York ISO. The brief was also informed by 3 key sources. One policy study from the nonprofit R Street Institute, a journal article by Lenhart and Fox from Boise State University, and a report from the National Association of Regulatory Commissioners, or NARUC. And next slide. So on to shaping stakeholder engagement. To frame our thinking, we look to FERC Order 719, which established new policies for stakeholder engagement intended to improve RTO responsiveness to customers and other stakeholders. To assess each RTO or ISO stakeholder engagement practices, FERC used 4 criteria: inclusiveness, fairness on balancing diverse interests, representation of minority positions, and ongoing responsiveness. Next slide. The other bookend of the regulatory context was set by NARUC's stakeholder engagement framework. While NARUC and FERC have different jurisdictions and authority, the intention for inclusive stakeholder processes, decisions that fairly balance diverse interests, appropriate representation of minority positions, and ongoing responsiveness is the same. Here in Figure 1, we see the different elements that NARUC defines when establishing a stakeholder engagement process. And as we'll see later in today's workshop, these elements mirror the questions that this group is wrestling with. Appendix A of the research brief is a summary of NARUC's emerging best practices for stakeholder engagement and questions that can help to design a stakeholder engagement initiative. So I hope you'll all have a look. Next slide, please. We can think of stakeholder engagement across 3 dimensions: the breadth of actors involved, the shared authority granted to participants, and communication and collective decision-making approaches. On the breadth of actors involved, this indicates who's engaged at the table. And typically at the existing RTOs, the breadth of actors is determined by the sector definitions used to define membership. The shared authority granted to participant helps to define what participants will do. Are they informed of a decision after something happens, consulted on the development of that decision, or empowered as central actors in the design of that decision? Most often, the authority of participants is determined by the RTO's governance structure, which I'll speak to shortly. Lastly, the communication and collective decision-making approaches that stakeholders apply determine how things happen. This includes the form, tone, and direction of information flow, and mechanisms for developing collective choices, such as a voting process. Next slide. I'll talk briefly about stakeholder governance process types. I understand that a different group is addressing governance and that folks are already familiar with the advisory versus shared governance construct. My point here is just to highlight that there can still be a lot of variation under the same governance process type. For example, among the existing RTOs and ISOs, an advisory structure is most common, where stakeholders provide feedback on or develop proposals and make recommendations for consideration and approval by a board of directors or governors. However, each RTO board exercises its authority differently under this advisory structure. For example, Southwest Power Pool's board meets concurrently with the members committee, a senior standing committee representing SPP stakeholders. The members committee conducts a straw vote on issues prior to the board's vote. And unless there's an appeal, proposals approved by the straw vote are approved by the board without further review. For ISO New England, any proposal with 60% membership support must be filed by the board with FERC, though the board can file a competing proposal and a jump ball for FERC's consideration. And lastly, CAISO is somewhat unique in applying a relatively informal stakeholder engagement process where any entity can participate as a stakeholder, but the staff and board retain responsibility for proposal development and decision-making on what's ultimately filed with FERC. Shared governance practices also differ between the two RTOs that take that approach. For the New York ISO, they require consensus between the board and members, while PJM divides authority between the board, transmission owners, and members, with members having authority over operating issues. Next slide. Under any governance process type, the actions that stakeholders engage in can be similar. Stakeholders are engaged to bring their ideas, to work together, iterate, and make proposals on how market rules can be refined to foster efficient market outcomes. This may include a lot of learning and coordinating to understand the diverse perspectives represented. In cases where stakeholders are asked to come to a shared conclusion or recommendation, consensus building, compromising, and group decision-making may also be needed. And there are also likely actions missing from this initial list, and I invite folks here to give that some thought as this work stream continues. Next slide. On to comparing across RTOs. Nearly all RTOs and ISOs leverage a committee structure to engage with stakeholders. Typically, there's a senior level standing committee that serves as a clearinghouse for stakeholder proposals. And here I've listed examples across the different organizations. These committees typically post materials to a publicly accessible website, have open meetings, and leverage subcommittees and working groups for topic-specific issues. Appendix B1 of the research brief synthesizes the practices of these senior committees and other recent stakeholder engagement initiatives to give you a sense of how they're operating. Next slide. And while there are similar practices at the RTOs and ISOs, there are also many nuanced differences. This table is from the Wenhart and Fox paper and compares across stakeholder engagement practices across the RTOs. I want to highlight the agenda setting line, which is about halfway down the table. I understand this agenda setting topic to mean who can identify key issues for an RTO or ISO to address. And I found it interesting that in organizations with more informal stakeholder power, like those listed on the left side of the table here, any stakeholder or entity can propose a key issue to be addressed. And as we move from left to right across the table towards organizations with more formal stakeholder power, the pool of key issues is sourced from a somewhat more narrow set of stakeholders, which may be shaped by membership and sector definitions. And surely there are pros and cons of having a broad or narrow pool of stakeholders to solicit input from. And I'll invite folks to give that some thought for this afternoon's discussion as well. Next slide. On the issue of membership sectors, here on slide 20, we see that the RTOs and ISOs use similar terms to define their respective sectors, but the number and possible grouping of sectors varies. We see that in the East, those on the right side of the table, there are relatively fewer number of membership sectors relative to those in particularly MISO and the Western Resource Adequacy Program. And certainly, again, there are pros and cons to having more or fewer sectors represented, which may be part of, I believe it's workshop 3 discussion. Next slide, please. The share of members in each sector varies broadly across the RTOs as well. This figure is reproduced from the Lenhard and Fox paper. Here, red and black boxes represent supplier interests. Gray shades represent sectors with mixed interests, and blue shades represent consumer interests. And while CAISO is represented in this figure, the use of sectors is only applied in the board nomination process, and there's no formal sector membership to CAISO. Next slide, please. Moving on from membership sectors, over the next few slides, I'll talk through how different RTOs and ISOs identify and prioritize issues to be addressed with stakeholder input. These processes are actually quite similar across the RTOs, so some of the slides I'll go through a little bit quickly, but all of the figures are in the research brief if anyone has a desire to look closer. So here we'll start with CAISO's annual policy initiative catalog and roadmap process, which occurs over the course of a year to determine the policy initiatives CAISO will undertake in the following 3 years. Any stakeholder can propose potential initiatives, and all proposals are posted to the CAISO initiative stakeholder page. Next slide. SPP published its stakeholder prioritization process in 2017, and it includes 7 steps that are quite similar to CAISO's process. Both include a broad call for possible issues, a prioritization step by staff or a group of stakeholders, and drafting, commenting, and finalizing a set of priorities. SPP identified that the factors assessed when prioritizing issues include the level of complexity, severity, and a high-level cost estimate. Next slide, please. RAP's detailed design document report documents its workflow processes. The left side of the figure indicates who's responsible for each action. To develop its annual work plan, the RAP Program Review Committee, the committee responsible for receiving, considering, and proposing design changes to the RAP, takes input from any entity, including participants, the committee of the committee of state representatives, board members, other committees, and members of the public. The program administrator or program operator then compiles those concepts for the program review committee's review. The committee reviews and prioritizes the recommendations and proposes a work plan with a schedule for developing those recommendations into change proposals. Stakeholders internal and external to RAP operations have an opportunity to review a draft work plan before it's finalized by the program review committee and approved by the board mid-year. Next slide. The New York ISO's project prioritization process is led by its Budget and Priorities Working Group. Stakeholders have the first quarter of the year to identify and present project candidates. The Budget and Priorities Working Group works with NISO to score and prioritize projects, and the work is built into the overall New York ISO budget. Next slide. Lastly, NEPOOL's prioritization process was only described in a high level in the resources that I was able to find online, but NEPOOL seems to follow a similar process of working with members to identify key priority items and considering the issues among others in the ISO New England budget. NEPOOL elevated priorities applicable to all members to the ISO New England, which were incorporated into its annual work plan. Next slide. So on moving an issue from concept to conclusion, each RTO or ISO applies its own process, but only a few publish their processes in publicly accessible materials. So here we have a smaller pool of examples to draw from, but not because the work isn't being done at all of the RTOs and ISOs, just the way that the processes are documented. So we start here with RAP's process to develop a proposal, which is done through a task force assigned by the Program Review Committee. The task force drafts a proposal, works with the program administrator, program operator to determine feasibility, and gets work plan approval prior to public review. Next slide. Once the proposal is released for review, there seems to be a stepwise process in which the public reviews first, then the Committee of State Representatives, then the Resource Adequacy Participants Committee, and then finally the board. Note that the review process includes multiple checkpoints where the proposal goes back to the task force for update. And there's potential for a second public review in the event that substantive changes result after the initial review and through the different steps of the review process. Additionally, the Resource Adequacy Participants Committee, which is part of RAP, has the power to terminate a proposal, but stakeholders can request that the board consider the proposal rejected by that committee. Next slide. Our second set of figures comes from PJM. Figure 18 shows how an issue is identified in the stakeholder process. Entities internal and external to PJM can recommend issues, and the PJM Members Committee decides what issues to take on. Next slide. Key documents required to initiate an issue include a clear problem statement, an issue charge, and a charter. Together, these documents determine the scope of the issue and how the committee or subcommittee will make collective decisions. Next slide. And once the subcommittee begins work on an issue, it works under the direction of and reports milestones to a PJM standing committee. This might be the Members Committee, the Markets and Reliability Committee, or one of the 4 standing committees addressing operating, planning, market implementation, and risk management. Next slide, please. I will talk just briefly about sector-weighted voting. Almost all RTOs use sector-weighted voting for collective decision-making within their senior standing committees. Working groups or task forces that report up to those committees may also have voting processes, but it's not always sector-weighted. Next slide. This is my last slide for today. We'll wrap up this presentation with sharing common concerns with stakeholder engagement processes. These are from the R Street policy study, but I think won't come as a surprise for folks in this group. So I won't read through each one, but welcome folks to read through the research brief for more detail or to also follow up with the original resource as well. So thank you again for having me today. I appreciate your time and attention. I will turn this back to Neha.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. So we'll invite folks to share any questions or comments they have either in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and you can come off mute when I call on you. My colleague Matthew did also put the slides and research brief links in the chat if you want to open those for yourself on your computer to peruse them as we go through our discussion. Let's see, and we have one question in the chat from, it says, in your research, what role did time play in selecting the appropriate stakeholder decision-making process?
So I would say time showed up, I would say, in different ways, I suppose. Like, for example, an SPP's prioritization process, level of complexity can also be kind of measured by time, or but it wasn't really an explicit, I wouldn't say that if it was perceived that something took a longer time, I'm not sure if or how that really influenced stakeholder decision-making process on that. I would be curious to hear from folks who have participated in these processes, whether time has had an influence on, you know, what issues RTOs decide to take on.
Thanks, Katie. And if there's a follow-up to that, feel free to raise your hand. Let's see, Robert Cromwell.
Yeah, good morning. Robert Cromwell, Umatilla Electric Cooperative in Eastern Oregon. And while it's certainly flattering to be described as dominant as an incumbent utility, I think it's the reality is very different. And I would just gently remind everyone involved in this process as we move forward that the load serving entities, the utilities that are participating in these processes, are really the people, the organizations that have a fiduciary duty to serve the public reliably and affordably. And so while I certainly understand how my friends in the advocacy community can sometimes feel at a disadvantage in these kinds of stakeholder processes, I would just gently remind folks that you know, many of us come at these discussions from a standpoint of owing a duty to thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that we serve, and to do so well, because the consequences when we fail to do so well can be quite severe. And ultimately, in the policy discussions that'll turn into business practices, that'll turn into operations in these contexts, if this initiative is successful, are ones that people across the West are going to have to rely on. And so I just really, while I can appreciate the sentiment that might have gone behind the drafting of this slide, I think it's important to remember that for many of us, the fundamental duty is to reliably serve those people that we do. And so our advocacy often is coming from that place. Thank you.
Thanks for your comments, Robert. Katie, I see that you answered the principal agent question in the chat, but can I just invite you to also share your response out loud for those who may not be following the chat?
Sorry, Neha, I didn't hear what you said after you said, can I just?
Oh, sorry. I see that you answered the principal agent question in the chat, but could you also share your response out loud for those who may not be following the chat?
Yeah, happy to. And this is taken directly from the research brief as well, but principal agent problem occurs when the interests of the agency, the group working for the principal, don't align with the interests of the principal or the decision maker. And the agent may work to advance their own vision rather than the interests that they are tasked to represent. A principal agent problem can also occur if the agent has more information than the principal, as can occur in the complex nature of RTOs and requirements for independent or unaffiliated RTO board members. In these cases, RTO staff may end up advancing positions that don't always serve public interest purposes of the RTO's board.
Thanks, Katie. And if the folks who have that question or +1 to that question have follow-ups, feel free to raise your hand and we can address those as well. Kyla.
Hey, thanks. So again, Kyla McNabb representing NRDC and the Sustainable FERC project. I'm going to preface this a little bit, is that the basis of my work for NRDC and Sustainable FERC is basically completely ingrained in the Southwest Power Pool, daily working group meetings and such. And so I felt it kind of important to point out there have been some very, very recent governance changes, particularly within the sector definitions that haven't shown up in your research. I noted the footnotes that the reports came from 2021 and 2017. And so just kind of did want to point those out, if that's all right, that there has now been the creation of a public interest sector within the Southwest Power Pool RTO structure, which does account for 4 current members: Lignite Council, NRDC, Sierra Club, and Western Resource Advocates. They do fall under the transmission using kind of voting split, but SPP has done a little bit of the restructuring within their sector definitions to account for this additional, pretty much new sector within their membership elements. And then there's other kind of membership updates that have happened as well regarding the exit fee and the membership fee within SPP that is also updated that I'd be happy to share. And I mean, this has been as recent as I think 2 months ago. So, because it's an ongoing conversation, because SPP is actually currently and has been over the past year undergoing a large scale kind of governance review, seeing if they needed to adapt their internal RTO governance processes, which of course then inform what's taking place within Markets Plus as well. So just wanted to point that out, and happy to answer any questions. And I'm also happy to send you those reference links as well.
Thanks, Kyla. Yeah, that would be great. Welcome from everyone, updated information as well.
Great, thanks, Kyla. A couple questions in the chat from Vijay Satyal. Can you please clarify what is meant by emergent definition to CAISO stakeholder authority on page 19? And Vijay, is this page 19 on the slides or the page 19 in the report?
In the slides, please. Thank you. Right there. Thank you. To the bottom left. I was just curious because I didn't see citation definition to it, and I apologize. I haven't read the report yet.
No, that's okay. And I wish I knew the answer, actually, what emergent stakeholder authority means in the CAISO context. This, again, is from the Lenhart and Fox paper. So I will have another look at that and can follow up.
Thank you. And the reason for my asking this is, as some of you may know, may not, I serve on the Regional Issues Forum as well. So we have sectoral representation on the RIF, but your slide 20 does a very good job showing CAISO has no membership sectors completely, whereas all other market structures have some form of sectoral representation. So it's in the same vein as Kyla, just a clarification that the RIF does have a very balanced sectoral representation. There is a sectoral representation structure in the nominating committee as well of CAISO. So I just want to put some color on that. But this is very appreciative and helpful. This is good work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Bill. Bill, you are muted.
Is this better?
Yes.
Thank you. First, I want to thank you, Katie, for what appears to be on a very cursory reading, a very thorough background paper. But that raises a question that I have had about this process, which is it seems very rushed. And the timelines for absorbing, digesting the material that you've put together are really difficult. And so my first question is, why are we moving so quickly in this area? It took FERC 45 years to develop a public participation process that was first mandated in PURPA in 1978. and for us to try to develop and address these issues in this essentially month-long time period seems really problematic. And the issues are complicated, and Katie, I think you've set them out very well, but there seems to me to be some areas that might be fruitful for further research, particularly the views of Nasuka, who has obviously been putting forward points of view on these kinds of issues, but doesn't appear to have been consulted specifically. And that raises kind of a larger question in my mind, which is that there's been in the pathways process a real lack of participation from retail consumers, particularly in the CAISO and in California, who've been very, very hard pressed. And so I'd like to, I guess, pose a second question. First, timeliness. Second, how do we get more robust participation from California end-use consumers? I also want to raise kind of a question that my brother from the co-op movement raised just a minute ago. Co-ops and munis are exempt from FERC jurisdiction under the Federal Power Act. And so their role in this kind of an effort is going to be very, very different. I was glad that he reminded us that they have an explicit fiduciary obligation to serve their end-use consumers, which IOUs and participating transmission owners who participate in the RTOs may not have. And so I'd like to understand or get clarification about how the particularly vulnerable position of end-use consumers in the IOU footprints are going to be represented both in the pathways process and then further in the potential RO moving forward. The RO issues, like I say, have been around for 45 years since PURPA mandated a consideration of consumer participation in Section 122. They're not resolved, and I really kind of think that trying to resolve them in the course of a month, notwithstanding the great issue paper that you've put forward, Katie, can be accomplished.
Thanks, Bill, for your comments. I'll take a first pass addressing some of the concerns you raised, and then I might ask my launch committee colleagues to share a bit more. So yeah, we appreciate that this is a lot of information for folks to absorb. Our intention in this, at least the first workshops 1 through 3, is to level set, and then that will culminate in members of the stakeholder process work group working on a straw proposal. None of those, it is a straw proposal, so it's intended to be just a first pass. And we welcome, the participation from anyone in these 3 and 4 workshops. And in terms of input into, what stakeholder engagement looks like in the eventual, in an eventual potential RO, that is entirely the purpose of having these conversations. So I will just ask if my colleague Kathleen has anything she'd like to add.
Yeah, and thanks, Bill. We really appreciate that you are engaging in these processes and raising your questions and concerns. I will answer this in a couple of different ways, and then would certainly welcome any of my other launch committee member cohorts to join in as well. I think we are moving quickly for a handful of reasons. I think this is, there is some urgency in the West around solidifying a large footprint for a future regional market. And this is an effort to try to get that done as quickly as possible. We are, as you can see, building on a lot of experience. And so really not reinventing the wheel here, but trying to take all of the experience that so many of the folks on this call and who have been working in this space now for really for decades, that we can build something based on a lot of the information that we already know and that we have experience with. And so I think our idea is we will move as quickly as we can to come up with a recommendation by this fall. These stakeholder process conversations are going to continue to be ongoing. What we recommend is just that, a recommendation. And as we go into next year and we are and hopefully able to start to build a new independent regional organization, these conversations, particularly around the stakeholder process, will be ongoing, and trying to ensure that we are continuing to get input and refine what that structure needs to look like. So I think while this sort of initial phase feels very fast, we really do look at this, particularly this part of the conversation, as something that's going to be ongoing. As far as the consumer advocate voice goes, we are actually very pleased that the Cal Advocates Office is able to now rejoin the launch committee. And so we have representatives from Cal Advocates back on the launch committee and engaging in this work directly. So we had Matt Baker at the beginning, and he left to take his PUC position, and now we're welcoming a couple of representatives from Cal Advocates to join us. This has been an area, we have a different work stream sort of entitled our public interest issues, and that's really where we're spending quite a bit of time focusing on the role of consumer advocates in this particular process. That work stream and that work group will work very closely with this work group to ensure that as we are getting that consumer advocate sort of recommendation with input directly from consumer advocate representatives, as we make those recommendations, they get fed into this bigger stakeholder process piece. So we agree this is a really critical voice in all of these efforts, and want to make sure that we are giving it a lot of time at this point and continuing to have that conversation ongoing. So really, again, appreciate the question, because I think it's one that where we see a lot of opportunity to make some improvements in existing processes.
Thank you. And I guess I should introduce, my name is Bill Julian. My whole name is Bill Julian. I was the legislative director for the PUC during the energy crisis. Been staffed to the policy committees in the California State Legislature for a number of years. And I've been involved with these issues way too long. I was involved with PERPA back in the 70s. So I have also been engaged in this for a number of years.
Well, we appreciate your experience and expertise on this too. So please do keep participating.
Thanks, Kathleen. Thanks, Bill. So we have just a few minutes left for Q&A. Kathleen and Sam, I'll invite each of you to share your questions, and perhaps we can address them both. So Kathleen, if you could come off mute, and then I'll invite Sam.
Sure, and I'll be brief. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I assume you can hear me, but if not, let me know. No, I just wanted to, I guess my question is, this is great background, and I'm looking for kind of some guidance on how do we provide our experience to this group on practical experience within this space, right? So for example, I'm a stakeholder at CAISO right now, but I've also been a stakeholder at PJM for years. And so, that's an interest for me that has helped inform a lot of my perspectives in these discussions, because I have experience on I kind of see as both ends of this spectrum, although they're not like rank ordered, but PJM has a very different framework, as you guys have laid out, versus CAISO. And so I have that variation, and I have developed a lot of nuanced views about the stakeholder process because of that. So if we start to deep dive on certain areas, like I can add context around some of these things. And I'll give you one example. if you look at PJM, you're showing sectors. But I worked for NRG Energy when I was at PJM, and NRG is both a load serving entity and it is a generation owner and has multiple different entities that participate in the market, whether it's an LSE or it's the generation. So NRG was in the generation sector. However, it actually was, from a ratio percentage, much more of a load interest. So when you look at these sectors, I just want everyone to be aware it's not black and white. There's nuances to this. So an entity has to pick their sector. That doesn't mean they have a sole direction or sole focus. And that can add some interesting nuances to the stakeholder process. That's one example. I'm happy to figure out a way to provide some other experiential, but that's my question. So where in this process do we do more of the sharing between those of us who have been in these processes to the group for their consideration?
Thanks, Kathleen. Certainly in the latter half of our time together today, we welcome you to share your experiences. Specific to the sort of sector representative piece, our third workshop, that is more of a focus there. And so encourage you attending that workshop. I mean, all of the workshops, but that one in particular. Sam, you'll be our last question, and then we'll take a short break.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Sam, go ahead.
Okay, I just wanted to respond to Bill's comments, I guess. I'm Sam Harper. I'm here on behalf of CLECA, the California Large Energy Consumers Association. And so I just wanted to, state my appreciation for the comments about the importance of end-use sector representation. I totally agree. It's critical we get that right, and acknowledge that it's not simple. These are complex issues. So mostly just raising my hand saying we're excited to be a part of this process, representing large industrial manufacturing type of consumers operating in California, and looking forward to being part of the process. So thank you all.
Great. Thank you so much, Sam. So with that, we are going to go into a short 5-minute break. Invite folks to rejoin us at 10:06, where we will get into some discussion. Thanks so much for your participation and attention thus far, and we'll see you back at 10:06. All right, welcome back. Serena, could I have you share your screen and share our discussion questions? Great. All right, thanks all. So we are going to spend about the next 50 minutes or so working through these 4 discussion questions, particularly with respect to the first couple. It may be helpful for you to reference either the research brief in full or these slides. Matthew or Serena, if I could have you put those links in the chat again so folks have easy access to them. And so we're going to start off with what I hope is a little bit of a softball. So invite folks who introduce themselves at the beginning, folks who have participated in our conversation thus far, to raise your hand or either put in the chat one similarity and one difference between the stakeholder engagement processes that have been presented that stands out to you. Oh, Mary's ready. Yes, go ahead, Mary.
Thank you. I have a response to that question, and then I also have a suggestion to make. Not sure exactly when the right time is to make the suggestion, but because I have the mic, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. So just on the first question on sort of similarity and difference, is the formality of the stakeholder engagement process, and to what extent engagement and input from stakeholders is formal or informal. Informal in the form of comments or advisory input or just thoughts from stakeholders, versus the stakeholders have a voting role, have particular authorities, and are able to participate in a kind of more structurally substantive way in the decision-making process. So that's something that really kind of stuck out to me on the different approaches, and I think there's definitely kind of a spectrum on the level of formality embodied in each of the structures, and I think that's an important element to consider in terms of trade-offs, in terms of the value of an informal process and the value of a more formal process, and what the trade-offs there are in terms of simplicity of decision making or streamlining of decision making, versus creating more formal process, which can potentially lead to more lengthy decision making processes or stalemates and things that can kind of slow down or make things more cumbersome. So I think it's just important to consider those differences, and then the trade-offs in terms of what sort of structure is ultimately landed upon. And I think that also dovetails into the suggestion that I was going to make, and something that feels a little bit missing to me in the material so far, and maybe that's what we're here to create here, is sort of the values or objectives in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. And I think some of that is set forth kind of in the FERC criteria, if you think about inclusiveness, or now I'm blanking on what the other ones were. Inclusiveness, how minority views are represented, how public interest organizations are represented versus utilities with particular obligations to serve. There seems to be kind of different buckets of objectives or values that we need to consider, and then kind of trade-offs on the different structural elements that are put in place to meet those objectives. So I think it might be helpful for this group ultimately to identify those objectives and then consider trade-offs to kind of advance the ball on what structure or what elements are important, particularly for this context, and what kind of the values of this group are. So I may have jumped way ahead there, but I just felt like that was something that felt a little bit missing to me in the materials.
Great. Thanks for your comments, Mary. And yes, I think we certainly do want to get into those deeper discussions, both in our discussion today, as well as in workshops 2 and 3, when we're thinking about specific aspects of the stakeholder engagement process. And as you mentioned, there's a spectrum of possibilities, and what the group, decides on or leans towards is very much related to the values and desires of the group. Kathleen.
Kathleen Colbert. Kathleen Colbert for Vista. I always get confused with Kathleen Stacks on the call. This is the only one that happens. So thanks for asking these questions. And I just wanted to throw out, I guess, a couple thoughts. So one similarity that I see across all of these processes is they're all striving to comply with FERC requirements associated with independent governance for the stakeholder process. So FERC has specific policy and rules that outline what is required. And so all of these ISO RTOs had to comply with that order, and they had to file those compliance filings. In some instances, many of them had to revise their proposals for their framework in order to comply with FERC's requirements for independent governance. So they're all striving towards a common goal. So that's one anchor I'd say is a similarity. They're all striving towards independence. They're all striving towards fair, balanced representation across all market participants. And in many instances, interested parties is kind of how you might refer to it, market participants, members, or interested parties. So I like to anchor us there. But one difference is, how do you get that, right? So they all have had a slightly different view of what they're, and it's driven by the culture of each ISO RTO, its individual memberships, whether that's actual regional cultures that have certain values. I appreciate what Mary was laying out, that culture, the value system has driven what some of these differences look like. The history of how the ISO RTOs have evolved has also driven it, right? So PJM came out of a power pool that had been operating for decades when PJM was created. So the power pool had its own membership, its own rules before the ISO was created, and that the RTO was created in its framework. So you have to remember that it came from a power pool framework and transitioned into the RTO, versus the CAISO did not come out of a power pool. It was created. And so it has a very different framework that comes out of a Western, California-centric mindset and culture. The differences I see as far as, do you have to pay to be a voter? Do you have to pay to be a stakeholder or not? I often see it coming from that old power pool culture, versus entities that didn't come out of that tend not to have as much of a, you have to pay to participate in the process. The voting, I think, is versus deliberation within a public meeting. Those are other key differences that again kind of come out of culture. I do think we need to spend a significant amount of time talking about whether or not there is sectors in voting, sectors without voting, or just open public meetings where everyone participates as an individual. Because for me, participating in multiple of these markets as a stakeholder, those have driven the most differences in how you engage as a stakeholder. Whether or not you're on an island by yourself, or if you see yourself as a part of a sector, whether or not there's incentives to compromise, which you can only get from a committee and a voting structure, versus if you don't have that, you don't have an incentive to compromise. So when we deep dive into that, I'm looking forward to those discussions. So I hope that's helpful.
Thanks so much for your comments, Kathleen. And yes, just a plug for the third workshop, where the topic at present is, what could a sector-based committee and voting structure add? So certainly we'll get deeper into that conversation. Mike.
Thank you. As we're talking about this, it reminded me that the approach that the ISO uses today is very different from how it was originally set up. And, people may never have known or have long forgotten this, but the original governing structure of the ISO was a 26-member stakeholder board. And you had people seated who represented all different interests, very much like the sectors that were presented earlier by Katie. And that system prevailed for 2 or 3 years and then blew up during the energy crisis. And I think both the state and FERC, perhaps for different reasons, decided that that wasn't a workable arrangement, and we ended up with the governance that exists now, which clearly needs to change. But I think it's just good to remember that we had an experiment with direct stakeholder governance early on, and it didn't work out very well.
Thanks, Mike, for your comments. And Scott Miller's clarification in the chat, when he says the ISO, he means the CAISO.
Yeah.
Ryan, I'll invite you to come off mute.
Yeah, this is Ryan Willard from NextEra Energy Resources. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
So going back to, let's see, question 3 here about a central issue or key challenge facing us. I think in looking at all this, if a common issue amongst all these structures is that the RTO and ISO staff are not required to respond to each piece of feedback, then irrespective of which stakeholder framework you land on, you may still not be addressing a fundamental issue that's going to continue to persist in any stakeholder process. So when I go back to Kathleen's earlier comments, I think that's where having a discussion at some point about the nuances of each process will be valuable, because maybe one process is more responsive in practice than another. But based on this report, I can't tell that. So I think having some discussion with folks that are familiar with PJM, SPP, and other RTOs can kind of marry up the practical realities of how this structure actually works and how responsive it is. Hopefully that makes sense.
Great, thanks, Ryan. And I'll just invite any final comments folks have on the first question before we move through to some of our deeper questions. I thought I saw, Scott, your hand was up, but maybe you've gotten your question or comment addressed.
No, I was about to respond to Mike Florio's discussion of stakeholder involvement and previous history, but I realized that it would probably get us off topic, and so I was reluctant to do it. Mike, you and I will talk later.
All right, thanks, Scott. Great. So yeah, Ryan's moving us along quickly through our discussion. Invite anyone to share additional thoughts about similarities and difference that they've observed between the stakeholder engagement processes in the chat. I'd like to move us though to question 2 and invite new participants, same participants, to share which of the processes that were presented makes you feel most comfortable versus which of the processes feels most challenging to you. Kathleen, go ahead.
Sure, I'll share my opinion. Kathleen from Vistra. I mean, my experience is it's very difficult to participate as a stakeholder under CAISO's process. There's asymmetry of access, asymmetry of information, versus PJM, where I participated, was very open, inclusive in practice, as Ryan alluded to. The committee structure and the ability to, and I don't know if it's the voting, but the PJM stakeholder process was incredibly collaborative and inclusive, versus the CAISO one is very, very hard for stakeholder to actually participate meaningfully in. And I won't comment on the others because I don't have direct experience, but that's my perspective.
Kathleen, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
Can you share a little bit about when you say the CAISO challenge, the CAISO process felt challenging to participate in? Can you share a little more detail?
Yeah, so ISO creates a process by which it allows for anyone to provide written input or verbal input, but it doesn't have a process by which it needs to actually consider that input. The other thing that it doesn't have is it doesn't have any kind of obligation to follow, like, to be responsive to concerns raised by stakeholders. And in practice, because it doesn't have any incentive to really engage stakeholders, because they don't need stakeholder support, right, to get anything through their processes in practice. And so there's no incentive for them to truly be involved with their stakeholders unless you have a special relationship, unless you have figured out how to build a rapport and a relationship where you get offline access and to those decision makers. That's what I mean by asymmetry of access and asymmetry of information. So the CAISO may only provide certain information to select stakeholders that it has interest in facilitating their coordination with them. And it really varies based on, frankly, the year, the time, and the high priority of the institution, who those stakeholders might be. So there's just a lot of uncertainty as a stakeholder in participating in their process. The other thing that is very different in CAISO is it's the only market I'm aware of that allows stakeholders to access the board. Every other market doesn't allow ex parte conversations with their board. And so that's an important element as well to consider. So that allows for asymmetry of access in lobbying as well.
Thanks for your additional commentary or detail to that comment, Kathleen. Fred, I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your last name, but Fred, please come off mute.
Buddy, hope you can hear me okay. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. I have a fair bit of experience with CAISO, some, not huge, and a little bit of experience now with the SPP and Markets Plus process. And I've been observing, from afar, some of the activity in the Eastern RTOs. The CAISO process, stakeholder process, not perfect. I think it is, for me anyway, has proven to be a pretty relatively easy way to get my input in, both in written and in the workshop format. And where I really think that although the SPP Markets Plus process is, kind of well structured, it is a very isolating experience. If you're not a formal member of a committee, then you're really not treated as others are. And it's not just about the voting, it's also about who gets recognized for speaking. It's about the weight that your comments get if you're not a formal member of that group. That is a really, for those of us who are not market participants, and we may feel somewhat differently about this, that kind of isolating aspect of it is really not very helpful. It doesn't feel great. And the other thing I think that I've really observed is that the transaction costs of a voting process, of a membership structure voting, sectoral structure voting type process, is pretty considerable. And the voting process ends up dominating the dialogue and the structure, the flow of the discussion in a very unhelpful way. Now, I hear the point about, voting being important for assessing group support and so forth. And I have some sympathy for that. But and I think there are definitely improvements that could be made in the CAISO structure. The last issue I'll raise, and I think I'll come back to this later, is the other issue that I think we're wrestling with now is the scale. The CAISO stakeholder process is already kind of creaking a bit under the number of participants who show up. The fact that we've got over 100 in this meeting gives some sense of that. And is that marginalizing or pushing to the sidelines voices that might otherwise be helpful because they feel like they don't have as sophisticated a view or, a directed stake or whatever? I think we need to think about the importance of scale here. And I don't find that either the CAISO process or the Eastern RTO and SPP Markets Plus in particular really address that in a way. I think we need to think about creatively about new ways to incorporate a much wider range of stakeholder input and a larger group in what we're doing.
Thanks, Fred, for your comments. I thought I saw another hand up, but it seems to have disappeared, or maybe I imagined it. Fred, one follow-up question to you. You use the phrase, you had concern with the transaction costs of a voting process. Can you share more about what you mean when you say transaction
Yeah,
costs?
I'm not thinking about expenses directly. There's a little bit of staff time, I'm sure, involved in, setting up any process. It's more of the time it takes to organize the voting within a specific issue, the amount of work that has to happen if you're in a sectoral approach in coordinating across your sector. I mean, a lot of that discussion is going to happen anyway. I get that. And the time it takes to manage an agenda, if you're a facilitator or a committee chair or whatever the role is, and to be able to allow for the time and just the time it takes to do the voting. It is a considerable time commitment within limited meeting time to do all that. And then one other thing I have to say is the way that those results are used can be used to push dissenting voices to the sidelines. We see this with reports of, oh, we got 95% approval on a vote on XYZ, but does that really fully reflect the depth of the discussion? It becomes a numbers game that I think is a bit unhelpful. The advantage of the CAISO process is that the open-ended participation doesn't have those kinds of transactional time commitment overlays to it, and I think allows for a more of a cross sectoral discussion that isn't so bound to the notion that at the end of all this we have to take a vote.
Great, thanks for those additional details, Fred. Vijay.
Hello, Vijay, WRA, Western Resource Advocates. I think I'm trying to address your question 2/3 combined. And I want to elaborate on what Kathleen Colbert brought up, which I think is important, but from a different angle. If you see page 27, which is moving an issue, when you compare moving an issue, though the RAP has different goals than what have you, PJM or ISOs, like PJM, CalISO, MISO, they're different than RAP. But ultimately, we're talking about stakeholder engagement. We're talking about either a market decision being made or reliability planning or whatever. On the graph one to the left, we see all the different components of engagement, whether it's the committees or the work groups, and ultimately decision making with the board of directors. I think if you were to update this assessment, it would be valuable to clarify where the staff has a primary role in moving an issue, or is there a sectoral authority or right in moving an issue? I think that makes a big difference. And we have noticed where 3 sectors may agree on an issue should be initiated, but staff may not feel important. And there is the Regional Issues Forum in CalISO, for example, where staff is very valuably supporting the sectors, but the sectors help work by consensus. So 2 things, the role of staff and where if it's explicit in their role and authority, and what is the touch points of response back. Those are my 2 thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay. And I see we have some active conversation going in the chat. If anyone who's been participating in the chat would like to share some of their comments live, verbally, I'd welcome that. I know that not everyone on this call is following the chat. Heidi.
Yeah, Heidi Rotz here with Clean Energy Buyers Association. Just wanted to share some examples of how energy customers show up, because I think that could be useful here. And to your question number 2, what makes us feel most comfortable? I've engaged in PJM stakeholder processes, SPP's Markets Plus, and Kaizo. And just to point out some things that have really worked for us as large energy customers, the ability to join fully and be part of working groups and really hash out issues the way we have in Markets Plus is fantastic when there's a desire to work at that level. So we've really appreciated that ability to be on equal footing with others and contributing ideas and working towards some solutions. But I would also say there's been some benefit in Kaizo where we don't always want to be that involved on every single issue. Sometimes we really do have some pointed input on specific things, and that ability to engage and kind of be more targeted on where we're going to share our input has also been really helpful. So just overall, there's benefits on both sides. And I do want to come back to Fred's idea of innovation. I really encourage this group to think about new ideas on what a governance process could look like.
Thanks so much, Heidi. Again, encourage continued dialogue in the chat. And then I think, feel free to continue to share which processes feel most comfortable, which ones feel challenging. I think those are getting that firsthand experience from some of y'all on the call is really helpful to the rest of the group who may not have direct experience with those processes. But wanting to move us a little bit into question 3 here, what appears to be the central issue or key challenge facing us in developing this stakeholder engagement process or in developing a new stakeholder engagement process? Yes, Scott.
I'll take a shot at this and welcome the input from others, because that's what the launch committee and those who are participating in this work stream as part of step 2 are hoping to get at is there is some people, while there are challenges in the Kaizo stakeholder process and Kaizo is trying to change. Some people value what they feel is the efficiency of what is being characterized as a top-down approach, whereas the benefits of the bottoms-up approach that people have been experiencing in Markets Plus, but also some of the Eastern RTOs like PJM. So the struggle, I think, is how we can get something that's very efficient, but one in which it's people feel it's transparent, they've got equal access, and it's a fair process. So finding that balance, I think, is in terms of whatever we get an input and the launch committee hopes to propose is going to be the challenge for what we can propose as part of step 2.
Thanks, Scott. I appreciate those comments. I'm going to take a second to skim through the chat, but if others have live comments that they'd like to make, please raise your hand. Yeah, Fred, go ahead.
Clicking all the buttons here. So thanks. I think the biggest challenge actually is the intention of the organization, I'll put that broadly, to have, and I really agree with what we just heard from Scott. It's got to be an efficient, open, and responsive process. And that's hard to do, but I think there are good examples, and I'm not just pointing to Kaizo. I think a lot of good things about the stakeholder process there, a lot of things that need significant improvement. And we've learned from what other regions have done as well. I think we need a bit of a reset here, because in my perception of what we're doing with the pathways process is to change the RTO governance model, not just in a kind of procedural way, but really to reflect a new approach that combines market operations, grid dispatch, and public policy as represented primarily in state policy across all the diversity of all the different state policies across all the different diverse states. Combine those together, because the big problem in the Eastern RTOs and ISOs in my view, is that that has not, in the multi-state ones, has not been resolved, resulting in constant, and in my view, I mean, you're going to have conflict, you're going to have disagreement. That's what all this is good. You know, we have to deal with that. But the amount of friction and controversy in the East, because public policy is not aligned with market design and operation, is it's been a problem for a long time. It's a growing, increasingly more difficult problem. The stakeholder process fits with the notion, in my view, of revamping the approach to market governance overall that Pathways is trying to pursue, and is an important part of achieving, in my view, that goal of having a better fit between public policy, especially state policy, in all of its diversity, so that no one state or group of states dominates, that the full range of public policy is fully represented. The stakeholder initiative, stakeholder process, stakeholder engagement, whatever you call it, has to work in close conjunction with that. So this, to me, suggests that we should be thinking about things not just in terms of what we like or don't like about the different existing approaches, but also about where we really want to go and what would bring us overall a better result for market design, operation, governance. And that's just a kind of generic statement, but I think it gets to me, it's not just a challenge of, okay, do we pick a voting oriented approach or a non-voting oriented approach, but rather what is the key challenge is to make sure that we have synchronized the stakeholder engagement process to the overall direction that we're trying to establish with this new approach to governance.
Thanks, Fred, for your comments. I'm going to invite a new voice to join us, and then we can move back to some of our other participants. Mona, would you like to come off mute?
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts on this. To the question of what's the central issue, first of all, I do want to endorse what Fred just said, that taking a broad look and stepping back as to, you know, the mission and the goal and the objectives of this this new market is an important perspective and vision to have. I also think that we're in a unique position relative to every other organized market in the United States, and I would say in North America, to take that fresh view. And we're also at this really pivotal time of looking at new technologies coming online and really changing what is an electricity resource, looking at the distributed side of the resource equation more fully. And I would just say one of the challenges that I have found in participating in several markets across the United States is to the inclusion of that voice in the decision-making process. In many instances, that voice is relegated to some sub-working group that isn't given the same kind of attention or weight, I would say, as other member classes. So that would be something that I think we should be taking into consideration as well. But I think it's an opportunity to take a more modern look at the way the electricity system is changing and try to incorporate that view into a stakeholder process. So just wanted to provide that perspective. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mona. Yes, there's as I mentioned before, there's some active conversation happening in the chat that unfortunately, I'm sorry, I'm having difficulty keeping up with both, but happy to see folks dialoguing there. I do want to move us to our final question here, because this is going to inform how we spend our time in our following two workshops 2 and 3. And so Serena, if I can invite you, actually just can we go to the next slide and I'll frame our question and then go back to our polling. Perfect. So the stakeholder process work group has identified these 7 questions as what we can focus some of our time on in workshops 2 and 3. And my question to the group here is, based on our conversation and discussion thus far today, does it seem that if we work through these 7 questions, our inquiry will be comprehensive? And I can place that question in the chat as well. And so based on the, key challenges and central issues that y'all have been identifying and discussing today, does it feel like answering these questions is going to get at the answers to those key challenges or central issues? And so my colleague Serena has put in a link in the chat to an external polling app, Slido. And my request for you here is, if you definitely agree that answering these questions is comprehensive and will be addressing the central issues and key questions that we've raised, to please answer a 5 on the poll or something towards that. Or if you think that, these questions are definitely not getting at the central issues and key challenges that we need to discuss, that you answer a 1 or something close to that. It's a scale of 1 to 5. Please let us know in the chat or out loud if you're having any issue accessing the Slido poll. And I'll put the prompt in the chat as well. And we'll just spend a couple minutes for folks to respond to that question. And if for some reason you're having difficulty with the Slido app, or if you'd simply prefer to provide your answer in another way, you can provide your answer in the chat as well. Brian, do you have a question? Or would you like to share your response out loud?
Yeah, it was not a question. It was just one narrow thing to share out loud, if that's appropriate at this time.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. So if I may very briefly respond to a couple of the different issues, perspectives raised previously that I just think are fantastic, that we are getting these issues out and really identifying, I think, some of the core tensions that we have. But also echo the call for innovation and new ideas to take the best of what we see in each of these different processes. We are not choosing one versus another. We have the opportunity to create something new that takes the best from what is, and perhaps new ideas as well. Coming from a perspective of an organization that represents a lot of the new technologies that are increasingly important in the energy system, I think that that's a perspective that is shared with non-traditional voices that have the opportunity to be represented here. And so thinking about different structures that can do that. And that is a little bit of a entree into just a very narrow point on number 4, when it talks about voting and how often and on what topic should voting be employed. We have how frequently should sector-based voting be scheduled, which is not necessarily does not need to be included in the discussion of voting. And I guess what I mean there is it assumes then that if voting is scheduled, it is on a sector basis and that you have sectors defined. And I just would like a little more, leave that a little bit more open. Perhaps the voting blocks are more organic or evolutionary or shift with different topics. For one, we represent a wide variety of interests that may shift depending on the topic. And I think Kathleen got at this earlier with where some of her previous employers shifted, were not necessarily aligned with the sector in which they were put in. So on number 4, if we get rid of sector-based voting there and say voting, and then how are voting blocks identified, and do they shift over time? Something to that effect, if that makes sense.
Thanks for those comments, Brian. All right, I see that voting in our Slido poll has slowed down. You're welcome to continue to put your responses in there or put them in the Zoom chat. I'm noticing in our polling, Serena, if you wouldn't mind sharing your screen for a moment. Or shifting which screen you're sharing. I know you're doing a lot right now. So of the folks in this room, we've got about 30 responses. We have a handful of folks that answered 1 and 2 on our scale, where 1 was if we address these 7 questions, will our inquiry be comprehensive? And it seems like we have a few folks who are saying definitely not, or something close to. Definitely not. And if those folks are comfortable who offered those responsive, if you're comfortable sharing a bit either out loud or in the chat as to what feels missing to you from our list. Kamaya, please.
Hi, Kamaya Abreu, Voltus. I think, maybe this was just a question of how to vote, but I agree with Mary's comment in the chat just now that it feels like there are some missing foundational questions, and perhaps it's assumed that those will be answered before getting into the specifics of the stakeholder, process and the technicals, but I just want to make sure that there's space to discuss those fundamentals in terms of values, goals, and particularities for the region and the moment.
Thanks so much, Kamaya. Others who'd like to share about what feels missing or feels it should be done differently on this list. And Serena, if I could maybe ask you to put up the list of questions again. Sorry, I know I'm asking you to do a lot of switching. Allie.
Yeah, the one element I didn't see in there that maybe worth adding, if it's within scope, is thinking about the solution decisions and how the decisions are made about what solutions are brought forward out of the processes. And that can sometimes be a sticking point. It may relate to voting, but depending on what the answers to the voting question are, then the actual discussion of what solutions move forward to a board or decision body would be important.
Thank you, Allie. All right. Anyone else who'd like to share? Kathleen, go ahead.
Yeah, just real briefly. It's more so as we evaluate the options, we also need to think about how the different tiers, and so this might be within standing and ad hoc committee status, but Mona flagged this in the chat, and so I wanted to say it verbally. We'll need to discuss how the different levels interact, report up or feedback down, all the way up through the board. So just to keep
Thanks, Kathleen. You cut out at the very last moment. You said how something moves up.
Yeah, sorry. So in number 6, standing in ad hoc committee status, what forums or committees do the sectors have? I just wanted to say if you broaden that to think about it more as an organizational structure. The top of the structure is the board, and then you move down from there. And so we will need to discuss how any kind of structure within the RO feeds up to the board or can be remanded back to the stakeholder process at different levels for further work.
Perfect. Thanks for that additional detail. Mike.
Yes, thank you. I think in talking about the role of stakeholders in the stakeholder process, it really is linked to what is the role of the board? You know, is the board supposed to, ratify what the stakeholders agree to, or does the board have sort of an independent duty to promote the public interest and come up with the best solution they can? I think I recall something in the write-up, about getting second best solutions out of the stakeholder process. And I think that's, when compromise is good, but sometimes compromise gets you, second best at best. And, sometimes you just need well-informed people to make a decision between option A and option B rather than coming up with an A minus B plus that may be not as good as either of the other two alone.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to have Bill be our last live comment, and please do put other additional comments in the chat. And then we'll move to our closing.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to Mike's last observation, which is that under state law, not-for-profit corporations like an RTO have various public interest obligations, and their boards have legal obligations to carry those out. In California, and this is one of the fundamental issues involved with the pathways process, in California, those board obligations are spelled out, those public interest obligations to the native load of California are spelled out. And the procedures for assuring accountability are contained in state law. And so one of the questions that the pathways process is going to deal with in a different work stream is, under what law will the RTO or the RO or whatever it is going to be incorporated? And so, Mike, to answer, or at least to respond to your observation about the board's obligations, those are legal obligations which are set out in the organic law. And we shouldn't disregard that in how we consider the input of constituents, stakeholders, the folks to whom the board is accountable.
Thanks for those comments, Bill. All right, so we are at 55 on an hour in wherever you are, 10:55 where I am. If we could move to our closing so that we can get you all on the way with the rest of your day. So thanks so much for your good comments and participation today. Today's discussion, both the live discussion as well as the active discussion that I know has been going on in the chat, that will be documented in a report that will inform the draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal, as well as particularly your comments on, if we answer these 7 questions, will our inquiry be comprehensive? We will take y'all's input and feedback on that as we craft our plan for workshops 2 and 3. And so to that, our next workshop is on July 24th. 9 a.m. to noon Pacific, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. Mountain, and 11 a.m. to 2 Central. And our overarching topic here is, how could issues and solutions before the regional organization get raised, and who leads? And as I mentioned, we will take your input and comments about the specific questions to be asked into consideration as we craft our discussion and plan for that workshop. And then again, just another reminder that after the third workshop, we will be soliciting written stakeholder comments on the discussion and content of workshops 3. And that will be also used to inform the draft stakeholder engagement straw proposal, which is a mouthful. With that, we have just a few minutes left. I will invite Kathleen or any of our other launch committee members if they'd like to share any parting remarks, or if anyone in the group here has last questions before we move on with our days.
I think this is Scott. I think Kathleen got kicked off because she was using the internet at her in-laws, and I think her in-laws subverted her by, you know, cutting down on the bandwidth. So Kathleen, I don't think, is with us anymore.
All right, no problem.
I'm back, Scott, and appreciate this comment.
Thank God. Thank God. And don't tell your in-laws what I said.
No, it's true.
Well,
Kathleen,
maybe I'll go ahead and share some closing thoughts. And first, I really appreciate all of the dialogue here. There's been a lot of really great information that has been shared on this call, and I appreciate especially that we can capture a lot of these in the comment sections, as well as in the dialogue that took place here. I do want to encourage everyone who has shared these thoughts to get in touch with their launch committee sector representatives or the launch committee directly through the email addresses that are posted on the Weeb website. We would love to get these thoughts early in our process. I know we do have a formal comment period on these workshops coming up, but I know that there's a lot of what we've seen here today, I think, is a lot of really good initial thinking on some of these topics, and especially for those who have shared, you know, really strong opinions. I think really getting engaged and part of this dialogue earlier in the process is very helpful. So really thank you to all of our stakeholders for stepping in and sharing your voice on this call. I will also note, I think there's been a lot of comments on the intersection of this work with the other work streams that Kathleen touched on earlier. And those public workshops are also noticed and posted. So encourage you to participate not just in this workshop, but in all of the different pathways workshops. We really appreciate GridWorks' support for facilitating the stakeholder workshop, because I think the dialogue here today has shown just how important and how engaged we are as a community on this topic. But there are additional workshops that the launch committee is hosting to touch on some of the intersections of these conversations with other work that the launch committee is doing. So please, share your thoughts with your sectors and with the launch committee members. We do have formal comments coming up as part of this process, but just again, thank you to everyone who has really articulated some great thinking already on this topic.
thank you so much, Pam. With that, we will let you all go on with the rest of your days. Appreciate y'all's input and feedback and good discussion today. Hope you have a good rest of your Thursday.